conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, our top stories we're going to be covering today focus on corruption in Kentucky. Now, obviously, corruption in Kentucky isn't a new thing. In 2017, 2018, both Illinois State University and Harvard University ranked Kentucky as the most corrupt state in the nation, and things haven't gotten much better. In fact, Best Diplomats in 2024 ranked Kentucky as the top 10 most corrupt states in the country, and it's largely due to something called legal corruption. Sometimes when you research whether or not Kentucky's a corrupt state or not, you'll find us in the low rankings because what they're looking for is convictions of corruption. What the other studies are looking at is things called legal corruption. Ways that in Kentucky it's a gray area or simply allowed for you to, well, help out your buddies get farther ahead. So we'll be looking at two stories regarding that. Also, we have school choices off to the races, people spending some big money. We'll take a look at the ads they're putting out, who's funding it. We're going to have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. As always, please, if you want to listen to the show, it comes out more than just Monday. If you're watching this on TV, listening to this on the radio, watching this on social media platforms, well, I just want you to know you can catch this show more often than just Monday, because the podcast comes out nearly 5 days a week. We go for 5 days a week. Sometimes things get in the way, but about 5 days a week. And the show specifically will cover mainly Kentucky issues. Of course, we do cover some national things from time to time. Longtime listeners of the show know that. But we do try to cover the Kentucky-specific issues. And so if you want to catch those shows, head on over to theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com. Hit the Listen Now tab, and you can see all the different places to go ahead and listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Also, from there, you can hit the Contact tab, reach out to the show, or you can also email info@theandrewshow.com. Well, without further ado, let's dig down into it. So, as I said at the top, Kentucky is a very legally corrupt state. It's widely recognized nationally as one of the most legally corrupt states in the nation. And to give you an example of this, today we're going to be covering stories that deal with both Democrats and Republicans, some things that are coming out about some different ones, and talk about how we should respond to them. And to start us off, we have an interesting occurrence out of the Beshear administration that was quietly done. This was originally brought to light about the possible corruption connection, the patting each other on the back, doing favors for your buddies out of the Beshear administration by Austin Horn from the Herald-Leader. Beshear had, on September 4th, appointed former Democrat Rep. John Will Stacy to the Public Service Commission. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Public Service Commission is, they are the ultimate body in charge of regulating our utilities statewide, specifically power and electric. I mean, they cover other utilities too as well, but the power and electric one has been most interesting. They've grabbed the headlines with, because we saw this commission politicized during the 2023 governor's election when the debate was coming down to shut down some coal-fired power plants and instead move to something like natural gas, solar, or wind. And Beshear was under attack for going after our coal industry in eastern Kentucky. And that particular service commission, after hearing all arguments, decided the day after the election, to allow these power companies to shut down those coal-fired plants. And longtime listeners of the show will know that during this past session, we covered how the legislature, recognizing that politicization and also recognizing that the body was largely coming after coal, put together another body to oversee that body that was heavily influenced by, of course, coal, as well as other places, in order to counteract Beshear's political moves that he was making with that committee. And further show how political that committee came, he put on this former Democrat rep, John Will Stacy. And it's worth mentioning because this from the article, in the mid-2000s, Stacy helped authorize $13 million in his state budget for a project his employer managed, raising alarms amongst ethics watchdogs at the time. According to previous Herald-Leader reporting, Stacy was employed by his alma mater, Morehead State University for a period during his service as a legislator. After the president ended Stacey's contract in 2001, Stacey put restrictive language into the state budget that limited Morehead's use of its funds in campus facilities. School officials called it a vendetta. Ultimately, Morehead's president resigned and was replaced, and the restrictions were lifted. So already we see that he's somebody that is willing to use the government powers and government levers to go ahead and go after his would-be political opponents. Exactly the kind of cutthroat politician with no morals you'd want to have in place if you're going to continue this push to destroy the energy sector here in Kentucky, specifically the coal sector here in Kentucky, because you owe something to your Democrat handlers if you want to run for president here in 4 years, which Beshear's eyeing up, we know that. And so they're going to go ahead and put this hatchet man in there to battle against this new committee being put into place and battle against the legislature's attempts to fight against Beshear's push. But there's another story here that's also reported in the Herald Leader, and it goes, later in his legislative career, quoting now from the article, later in his legislative career, Stacey supported a natural gas pipeline that drew strong pushback from the affected landowners, known commonly as the Bluegrass Pipeline. Beshear represented the company pushing for the pipeline when he was a private practice attorney before taking office as Attorney General in 2016. So while Beshear was in private practice, he represented the company putting in place a pipeline that then Stacey was the one who supported and really pushed heavy on in order to go ahead and build this pipeline, and had to use eminent domain and other things was what he was advocating for to go ahead and get the pipeline done. And so it's fascinating to me that we can see out in the open here what is legal corruption. Just flat out. Where we have Beshear rewarding, and this is how the system works. It doesn't even have to be an explicit tit for tat, you do this for me, I'll do this for you. All it has to be is something where I will get you back eventually, and then you follow through. So when it comes time when you tell your other people you need to get things done, say, hey, I'll return the favor. You have people who can testify that you are the type of person that would return the favor as you promised. And in this case, the favor is being returned to put on the Public Service Commission, a very powerful position. And at the same time, it's exactly who Beshear wants in place as the energy battle in our legislature heats up. But that's not the only story of corruption that's getting circulated. We have a story coming out of the Kentucky House Democrat Caucus, who's just had a lot of issues in this cycle. I mean, you've had obviously Representative Daniel Grossberg's issues with sexual harassment. Everybody and their mother, I'm surprised his mother yet hasn't called him out, but everybody and their mother has called him out for being a little inappropriate, a little fresh with the ladies, and have told him to resign, step aside. They've kicked him out of caucus. So you have that turmoil going on. You also have DUIs. I've covered that in prior shows. And you now have another story dealing with Sherilyn Stevenson that's going around the social medias regarding her and a lobbyist getting a condo together, which raises some other questions about everybody on all sides of the aisles, their relationships with lobbyists, and how this entire system is infected with a lot of questionable activities. We'll be going over that after this short break. As always, if you want to reach out to the show, feel free to email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. You can also head over to theandrewshow.com, check out where else to listen, and hit the contact tab to reach out to the show. But we'll be back with these other stories of corruption after this short break. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So coming out of Frankfort, we've got some news regarding a Democrat House rep, specifically Sherilyn Stevenson in House District 88, and a lobbyist, Sarah Bowling, may be engaging in illegal activities, possibly, based upon what's going on and the evidence being shown. It would appear, it's alleged, that Sherilyn Stevenson and Sarah Bowling, this lobbyist, jointly purchased a condo in Frankfort together. Now, the first question a lot of people ask, why does Sherilyn Stevenson need a condo in Frankfort? House District 88 is both Scott County, Georgetown, as well as Lexington. That's not very far from Frankfort. We're talking maybe a 30 on the high side, 45-minute drive to Frankfort. That's not a very long travel. Certainly not when, it's just a normal commute. It's definitely not something people would normally get a condo together for. So some people wondered, why did she purchase the condo? And obviously there's different questions to go apart. Is she Airbnb-ing? Is she renting it out short term and then it's there for her to use if she wants to use it while in Frankfort? And why would she need a condo in Frankfort? Well, this goes into a little bit of the culture of Frankfort, which I think we should touch on, because while 45-minute drive doesn't seem very long, sober, that is a pretty arduous distance if you've had a few too much to drink, especially if you're in Frankfort, Kentucky. Because I don't know exactly what the Uber and Lyft availabilities are. I'm sure they have Uber and Lyft, I believe, in Frankfort. Didn't check before I did the show, but I'm assuming they do. But the cost to get from Frankfort back home must be extremely expensive. And then you throw in a hotel room. Now that gets up there in price. And so if you're spending, I'm not saying Sherilyn Stevenson is getting drunk often in Frankfort. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that if you live in Georgetown and Fayette County and you are getting drunk often in Frankfort, eventually it would become worthwhile for you to perhaps get a condo, perhaps even get a roommate to own that condo with, especially if that's your common drinking buddy. And that goes into, once again, the culture of Frankfort, because you, as a Frankfort legislator, could literally, especially during session, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and drinks, not pay a single dime for months on end for anything you're consuming. See, the way the rules are wrote, they cannot specifically give one individual a perk. They can't give you something of value as an individual. However, if they have swanky parties and gatherings and events and receptions, and they invite all legislators to attend, well, that starts to become a legally gray area. We saw this with the Louisville Orchestra offering everybody a chance for a reception and the ability to watch Wicked. Meanwhile, they're asking for over $4 million from the legislature that they got in order to fund something else that they were doing, even though they, of course, are a profitable entity, have money in the bank, and earning net revenue year over year. They still got $4 million of your tax funds, and they do these same types of tactics. So why would you need that? Well, one answer, not saying it's Sherilyn Stevenson's answer, but one answer is you are just getting drunk way too often, and you're unable to drive or find transportation, and the cost of hotels are certainly racking up. But it does call into question the relationship between Sherilyn Stevenson and her lobbyist friend. Because while you're allowed to be married to a lobbyist, accepting gifts and things of value from a lobbyist, now there's, like I said, there's kind of a carve-out gray area if you're married to one, but accepting gifts and things of value from a lobbyist are strictly prohibited. So that then becomes a question of, is Sherilyn Stevenson, assuming she owns this condo with Sarah Bowling, like I said, it's being alleged by a few people, showing their sources of the purchase amount and everything else. So, and as far as I've seen, Sherilyn Stevenson hasn't come out to clarify this. It should be worth asking, especially because she plans to run for leadership on the Democrat side. She wants to be in charge of all 20 of them that are in the House. But regardless, questions should be asked about, is this accurate? Would you like to respond to this? But we haven't gotten anything quite yet back from her. But when we look at the situation, is it a situation where is the lobbyist covering every single dollar of the mortgage and then you get to own half of it? Are you paying 50-50? Are they renting it out? Are they splitting those revenues? Or is the lobbyist slipping more revenues into Sherilyn Stevenson's pocket? These are all questions that need to be answered. And when we look at the lobbyist, Sarah Bowling, we can actually see her reported active employers include places like All Points Broadband Partners, Alliance for Automotive Innovation, the City of Madisonville, Kentucky, the City of Pikeville, Kentucky, Community Action, Kentucky, Dream.org, FFF Enterprises, Independent Electrical Contractors, Bluegrass Chapter, KY Association of Independent Recovery Organizations, KY Center for Grieving Children and Families, KY County Attorneys Association, KY Primary Care Association, Morehead State University, University of Pikeville, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, some of those that I named off, a good fair few of them, are actually taxpayer-funded entities as well. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to point out that in this case, this individual is working with a lobbyist that is paid for out of the taxpayer's pocket. And this is a reminder as to why we need to ban taxpayer-funded lobbying. This has been a bill proposed several years now. Felicia Rayborn, representative out of the Northern County, Owen County area, has proposed a bill banning the ability for taxpayer-funded entities to hire lobbyists. Because, of course, what ends up happening is they take your tax dollars from your pocket and then they turn around and use that money to hire somebody to then go after more of your tax dollars. It's certainly a inside-outside game that leads to a lot of questions regarding ethics and morals. And, of course, quite frankly, it's a ridiculous behavior that should be called out and stopped. And we're literally in the process of trying to pass that kind of legislation each and every year, but it's not per se working out. But regardless, she's working with this lobbyist. This lobbyist works with her all the time, and they're owning a condo together. But this inappropriate or questionable relationships with lobbyists isn't new. I mean, for an example, here's on the Republican side of things. We can look at outgoing state senator Damon Thayer. Damon Thayer, obviously very influential when it comes to passing legislation that affects specifically the horse tracks. Thoroughbred owners and things it affects too as well, but specifically the horse tracks. He was a big proponent of passing sports betting, but only as long as it was run through the horse tracks and the same entity, so the horse tracks can go ahead and get their VIG, get their cut. Because when you look at apps like FanDuel and other sports books and betting places and websites, they're all having to run through a Kentucky horse track in order to go ahead and do that, in order to take those bets. And also, big proponent and big pusher of banning gray machines. Those of you who may remember this, gray machines are quote-unquote skilled games that were a lot like slot machines. And of course, the horse tracks who have slot machine type facilities called historical horse racing, well, they were affected by these gray machines and they wanted them taken care of. And Damon Thayer was a big point of taking those down. Damon Thayer is also a big part of course, getting historical horse racing legalized. This is a story people don't talk about a lot, but here in Kentucky, the horse tracks for a long time were running these slot machine type machines that run on a historical horse racing that make it somehow parimutuel gambling. It's something to do with its algorithm. And they were claiming that it was legal for that reason, and then they were sued, and it went through courts after court after court, till finally Supreme Court pretty unanimously ruled that they were clearly violating the law, and that if they wanted the horse tracks to be able to gamble this way, a new law had to be passed, and they gave a deadline to either tell the horse tracks they need to shut down their HHR slot machines and casinos, or a law had to be changed. And Damon Thayer was a big pusher of getting that law changed so they didn't have to shut down those slot machines. And I bring all that up to point out that he's effectively seeming, based upon his behavior in a way, lobbying for these horse tracks. Meanwhile, his day job was a consulting company, is a consulting company that consults specifically with horse tracks and horse owners on issues. A legal way, one could say, of receiving payoffs from the very people that you're supposed to be regulating. It's out there in the open. Anybody could find it. It's in his financial disclosures, but it really doesn't matter because it won't be stopped, because once again, it falls into that legal corruption side of things. But there's also other people who have some pretty questionable relationships with lobbyists on both sides of the aisle. For an example, you have Robert Stivers, president of the Senate. His wife, for a long time, was the state affairs and policy advisor, state affairs director when it came to PCMA. That's the Pharmacare Management Association. And so she was essentially a lobbyist on their behalf while her husband is the president of the Senate. But that's not the only story we have either. We can turn to other people within the Senate to point out the very same thing going on in the Republican Party. But then that also brings up the question of what do we do in response? How do we handle these issues? When we find this kind of situation going on and we find it so blatant and obvious, how do we handle it? How should we respond? Because the Sherilyn Stevenson situation brings up a question of, oh, do we vote her out? Do we not? How do we handle that? Well, that's a part of, I think, a greater discussion that we're going to have after this short break. So I'll talk about one more story of legal, I don't want to say legal corruption, but some questionable activities to point out some close relationships with lobbyists going on in our state Senate. And then on top of that, we'll then go into how do we deal with the Sherilyn Stevenson situation? How should we handle it and hold people accountable? So that's part of the question as well. We're going to have all that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, I was going over some corruption going on the Democrat side of the aisle. It's kind of been a big part of today's show. And I started to touch on some questionable activity going on the Republican side of the aisle. And I'm talking about both sides for a specific reason when we start digging into how we respond to people like Sherilyn Stevenson's alleged maybe legal corruption would be the best way to claim it, of owning a condo alongside a lobbyist and then not being very clear or transparent on exactly how that payment is structured, how everything's going through that. It certainly shows a very close relationship with a lobbyist. And so that definitely leads to a lot of ethics questions, to say the least. And I talked about a few other Republican examples, but one I think also worth talking about, also in the state Senate on the Republican side, deals with Amanda Mays Bledsoe. Amanda Bledsoe is the senator out of Lexington, and it's important to notate, and obviously those of you who know my background know I was a part of this story, but what the legislature ended up doing, Amanda Mays Bledsoe had two primary opponents. I was one of them, because when I originally filed to run for the state Senate, I filed against Alice Voorhees Kerr, a very far-left, quote-unquote, Republican senator that literally was putting forward legislation specifically on LGBTQ issues because she watched a fictional movie, and so that made her decide to put forward legislation to protect LGBTQ people because of a made-up story. But anyways, and when I filed to run, Alice Voorhees Kerr shortly thereafter decided she wasn't going to run for office again, and Amanda Mays Bledsoe, as well as Ross Mann, went ahead and also filed for that seat. And in filing for those seats, as well as a Democrat opponent filed for that seat. Well, during redistricting, the Senate redistricted every single one of Amanda Bledsoe's opponents out of her district. The Democrat, myself, and Ross Mann clearly anointing. And by, redistricting them, it was literally like drawing a like circle around my specific precinct, and like the other side of my road that I lived on was in the district, but my side wasn't. That was how specific they got to trying to make sure nobody could run against Amanda Mays Bledsoe, because she was already chosen. They wanted her in the Senate, and a big part of the reason why they wanted her in the Senate was because she, on the city council, had already proven to be a little more flexible with her conservative morals if it meant political power, but also because they're already a part of that political apparatus, because her husband was a lobbyist here in Kentucky, was also, that was back in like 07, 08, but her husband was also a lobbyist, I believe in, was it 2017? Yep, 2017. He was a registered lobbyist 2015, in Arkansas, and he's currently fulfilling a lobbyist type role for a company up in DC, as I am told. And so when you start looking at, and of course all those positions too, this is the other thing that's interesting, as we talked about Robert Stivers' wife being a state director of state affairs for a pharmaceutical group, and then also Amanda Mays Bledsoe's husband, lobbyist and representative for pharmaceutical groups as well. A lot of money in the pharma side of lobbying, apparently. But regardless, that shows that we have corruption on the left, but also corruption on the right. And so how do we respond and deal with these problems? And that goes into a little bit of conversation about political tactics, because here's the situation with Sherilyn Stevenson, and longtime listeners of the show this won't surprise you. You know how I feel about this specific race, because in House District 88, that's where Sherilyn Stevenson is running for re-election out of. That's part of Fayette and Scott. It's a very close election, has historically been very close for Republicans to take that seat the last two election cycles. And so this time around, there's a new person running that goes by the name of Vanessa Grossell. And those of you, like I said, who've listened to the show for longer than around a year know exactly how I feel about that specific candidate, because Vanessa Grossell is a former Democrat who's thrown an R next to her name, recently changed her registration, in 22, 23, has donor history includes giving money to people like Pete Buttigieg, running for president, and is a person that is quite clearly on the left side of the issues, that then turns around and is now trying and attempting to run as a Republican. And I've had interactions with Vanessa Grossell. I'm sure she comes across as a very nice person. Now, if you know her background, she's very disingenuous. For an example, she'll often play I'm kind of undecided on my state policies kind of role, tell conservatives and Republicans, I don't have very many policies or feelings about that. I only ran because of school choice. I was really passionate about school choice, which is a funny claim because I've heard her challenged on, what she thinks then a good school choice option would be, and she doesn't quite have a policy for that either. But in general, her pretending she doesn't have any policies is ridiculous, considering in her prior job, she was a state policy advisor. So either she was horrible at her job as a state policy advisor, or she quite clearly has policies and beliefs. She's been a donor to liberal city council members in Lexington, and I've also talked about how, donating at the national level to very far left individuals for years and years and years, and then suddenly becomes a Republican. And so those of you who understand what I'm saying here, in that race, I've encouraged people to sit it out. I'm not telling you to vote for Sherilyn Stevenson, especially after we're seeing how quite corrupt she is, but I'm saying that none of them have earned your vote. Both of them are liberal and a Democrat, so maybe it's best if you don't vote at all, because your vote in that situation, if somebody like Vanessa Grossell wins, it does far more damage to conservatism, to the liberty side of things, if that's who you are, but to conservatism for her to be in that seat than Sherilyn Stevenson does, because of where we are. Now, for an example, where we are as far as who holds the most seats and how's the power balance should come into play anytime you're voting. I think that should be incredibly important thought. For an example, I find Andy Barr's voting record to be bad. I think he's a big government, big spending, establishment stooge, for lack of a better term, and I will never vote for him in a primary, period. But what I do know is it's also a very close House. Republicans really have a majority by a few seats. And so by Andy Barr holding this seat for an R, the 6th congressional district for an R, it provides the opportunity for people like Thomas Massie to be on the Rules Committee because the Republicans in general are in power, or Comer to be on the House Oversight Committee, to be chair of that, because Republicans are in power, so it gives them the ability to be the chairs of committees. And that's incredibly important to understand as we're talking about who we vote for and when, because when you're voting for who you want in power, you're voting for two things simultaneously. You're voting for what party you want in power, because then that party who's in power in that particular legislative body, whether that's the House or Senate, gets to choose who's on what committees and chooses who the chair is. So right now in our state house, we have 80% Republican, 20% Democrat. Sherilyn Stevenson, with all her liberal beliefs, will never be a committee chair unless the Republicans completely lose their minds in our current state legislature. However, Vanessa Grossell more than likely will be a committee chair within the next 2 to 4 years if she beats Sherilyn Stevenson. And so while she has an R next to her name, she has very liberal beliefs and a very liberal background. And so even if you say she's only 75% as liberal, if Sherilyn Stevenson's 100%, Vanessa Grossell, the Republican running, she's 75% liberal, and Sherilyn Stevenson's 100%. Isn't that better? No, it's not. Because Sherilyn Stevenson can't get 100% of her priorities done. But Vanessa Grossell can get some of that 75% of the priorities done and can stop good things, especially as a chair of a committee. And the way you become a chair of the committee is by doing the bidding of leadership. And when you're already willing to sell out your political beliefs and priorities simply in order to get into office, you think you're not going to sell out in order to be chair of a committee to amass more power and feel more important? Because you've already sold out to be in that position in the first place. So you can see why you'd have two different standards. If it's a close House, close Senate, sure, you may not like that particular Republican, but maybe you should vote for them just simply in order to maintain the Republicans overall having power. If you're voting for Andy Barr and you don't like him, you're not voting for Andy Barr, but you're voting for, like I said, Thomas Massie to be on the Rules Committee, for Comer to be on the chair of the House Oversight Committee, so on and so forth. So it's something you have to consider. Well, coming up after this, we'll go over school choice. Big spending going on. We'll have that after this short break. And you're back here on this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So school choice spending is getting underway on the ads. And we're going to see a lot of school choice ads coming up over the next month or two because in general, Kentucky, ad buying is going to be a bit down. There is absolutely no statewide elections going on. Obviously, the senator seats aren't up for re-election, but even congressionally speaking, there's no real competitive races going on there, so you're not going to see a bunch of money spent, generally speaking, in either direction. I mean, obviously, you're going to see some of the incumbents spend some money just to, keep fending off, and they have the money to spend. You can't use it on anything but campaign expenses. And, well, how many car trips and personal security and haircuts can you pay for with the millions of dollars before you have to spend some of it on ads to show that's going to something and to maintain your hold? So you're not going to see a whole lot of that per se. And generally speaking, unless you're in a few very key districts within Kentucky that are competitive for both the Democrats and then the Republicans in the state House or state Senate, you won't see any ads going on for generally local races either. And then even farther down than those races, when you start getting into ultra-local races, really there isn't too much spending going on. You might see some school board spending going on in Lexington, but generally speaking, the airwaves will be free of political spending. Now, not to go too much down into the rabbit hole for those of you who don't understand exactly how this all works, basically, so one time slot will have 4 different prices. And basically, the lowest price is, look, if you don't have anybody else above me, play my ad. The next price is that, okay, if you have what's called a P4, that's the lowest. If you have a P3, well, then that will go in front of the P4s, and then a P2 goes in front of P3s and P4s, and P1s go in front of P2s, P3s, P4s. So if you really need your ads to air, you have to buy ads at a certain rate, and you get a certain percentage to show. P1's 100% guaranteed it airs. The otherwise, you're hoping nobody buys in on those same spots at a higher rates. And so when you have less political ad spending in general going on, it means that the likelihood of those spots being taken over gets lower. So instead of paying P1 or P2 rates, you end up paying something like P3 or even P4 rates on a lot of these channels. So you're going to start seeing a lot of these ads from the school choice, but there's also a lot of money to throw around on both sides of the aisle. This is one fight where the liberals don't necessarily have the advantage on. So on the liberal side of the aisle, their mega donors especially do a better job of seeing the bigger picture. And so you'll see situations like abortion where the pro-choice side, quote unquote pro-choice, pro-murder side, will have millions of dollars to spend on campaigns, while meanwhile the pro-life side, there's not as many individuals that really support the pro-life with huge amounts of money. There's not a lot of giant organizations like Planned Parenthood on the pro-choice side, on the pro-murder side, and then on the pro-life side of things, you don't have those kinds of giant taxpayer and part-funded organizations. But on school choice side of things, you do have still those taxpayer-funded-isk in-part organizations, specifically the associations like the teachers unions and some other associations, funded through obviously collecting essentially a tax on the payroll of a lot of the teachers and administrators within the school districts. And so it's tax money paying the teachers and administrators, and then that tax money gets passed on to the school unions. They get their VIG off of the employees. Basically, there's a group that is the school staff and employees that have a vested interest, especially the administrators that are high paid on taxpayer dimes, that have a profit interest in keeping things the status quo, to continue to put more funding into the schools as well, despite the fact that it doesn't matter how much money we give them, they keep failing. But on the other side, you do have some altruistic mega donors like Jeff Yass, for an example, dumping millions of dollars into school choice initiatives like this one, because they do see that it's important to our schools improving overall across not just the country, but also here in Kentucky, and that affects everything overall, and offering more educational opportunities. A lot of these, especially billionaires, are self-made billionaires, where having the opportunity of a good education and seeing their parents and families, or even millionaires too that are donors to this, they saw that opportunity of having a good education. They saw their parents maybe scripting or trying to come together with the money to pay for private schools or to help them out as much as possible. And they see that if we want to help other people succeed and have the same opportunities they have, well, we need to give them the opportunity to go to the same schools they have. And how do you do that? Because you'd say, well, they went to private schools. How do we give people that opportunity? Well, we can't just say, well, just have government run the private schools, because government running the public schools is what's destroyed them. And so it offers kind of that opportunity. So we are seeing some spending going on. This ad here is from the Yes side.
I'm a public school supporter. I wanted to make a difference and help children. In states that have had maturing school choice programs, they're finding profound benefits in the public schools. Students have higher test scores, and there's lower suspension rates, and those benefits are really profound with low-income students. That competition just elevates results for everyone. School choice will give Kentucky students the best opportunity to succeed.
Vote yes on Amendment 2 for educational freedom. Protect Freedom PAC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
The gentleman speaking is a former principal at Anderson County Schools. Those of you may remember a story a few years back of the principal at Anderson County Schools that refused to hide gender transitioning from parents. There was a KDE, Kentucky Department of Education, policy to hide those gender, if a child was changing genders at school, to keep that from the parents. He came out and refused to do so, refused to take part, and then things ensued, and he's no longer a principal. But a big part of, obviously, the reason why he would support school choice is because it provides more opportunity for employment, for teachers, for principals. And that is one conversation I've had with quite a few former teachers or current teachers, is about right now you really only have one employer, especially if you're in a rural area. The only person you can work for is your school district in that county. There's no other place you can go and use your degree in teaching and also your passion in teaching per se within your county. Now, maybe you could go to some neighboring counties, but if you're in a rural area, you have maybe 5 total employers to choose from if you want to stay within your selected field. And then you go into schools and the local, even some of the bigger districts like northern Kentucky areas and others. There really isn't a whole lot of necessarily private school choices to choose from, because obviously the people limited to private schools right now are the ones that can afford it, because there's no assistance being given to other middle class or lower class students in order to be able to achieve going to these kinds of schools. And so where they don't have as many students going to them, there's not as many job openings. And I remind people that with school choice, there would be more openings, obviously, at private schools. More people go over to private schools. And so the teachers have more opportunity and more competition for their labor. That will drive their wages higher necessarily. Because, and I've gone over it time and time again on this show, how much more money these school districts are giving and how are getting from the states, from the federal governments, from local taxation, and how that money is not ending up in the teacher's pocket. They are not raising teachers' pay with that. Instead, they spend more and more on administrators and personal wealth or wellness coaches like they do for the superintendent in Fayette County. Then they actually spend on pushing forward and helping out the teachers. We also have a 30-second ad from the anti-amendment crowd. Let's take a listen to that.
As parents, we want to improve Kentucky schools.
But Amendment 2 and vouchers are not the answer.
Amendment 2 would use public money to fund private schools.
90% of Kentucky students attend public schools.
Let's improve them.
We should invest in better ideas that work.
Like increasing teacher pay to fix the teacher shortage.
Smaller classes to give students more one-on-one attention.
And fund universal pre-K to give all our students a great start.
The voucher amendment is not the answer.
Now, what's funny is those are always funded by, mainly education associations and teachers unions, always talking about how teachers need to be paid more. One thing I brought up on social media and posted about was it's interesting that they say teachers need to be paid more and schools are broke, but then these unions turn around and charge such high membership fees that they have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to spend every year on obviously losing campaigns, i.e. this past primary election where they got behind some pretty awful Republican people in primaries that went on to lose, like every single one of them lost, blew hundreds of thousands of dollars on it. And so if they really want teachers to make more, maybe they could just, lower their fees or not charge them. I don't know, just an idea. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I thank you all so much for joining me. We'll be back here tomorrow. Hope you have a great rest of your day.